Picture this. It's 1491. Somewhere in what would one day be called America, a thriving village sleeps peacefully under a blanket of stars. Children dream safe in their beds. Elders share stories around dying fires. Warriors rest easy knowing their families are protected. This is the last night of the old world. Tomorrow, everything changes forever. But here's what they don't teach you in school. This wasn't just one village. This was happening across an entire continent. From the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, over 100 million people were living, laughing, loving, and dreaming. Cities larger than London, trade networks spanning thousands of miles, scientific discoveries that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. So why do most people think Native America was nothing but empty wilderness? Tonight, we're going to uncover the truth about that peaceful night and the incredible civilization that was about to face its greatest test. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about American history. Close your eyes and forget everything you think you know about pre-Columbian America. Forget the Hollywood stereotypes. Forget the history books that start with Columbus. We're going back to 1491 to see the world as it really was. The sun is setting over Cahokia, a bustling metropolis in what is now Illinois. With over 20,000 residents, this city is larger than London at the same time. Massive earthen pyramids rise toward the sky, some taller than 10-story buildings. The Great Plaza bustles with merchants from as far away as the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico. Copper from Michigan, shells from Florida, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. This is the center of a trade network that spans half a continent. But Cahokia is just one jewel in a crown of civilizations. To the southwest, in what we now call New Mexico, the ancestral Puebloans have built magnificent cliff cities that seem to grow right out of the rock itself. Mesa Verde, Canyon de Chelly, Chaco Canyon. These aren't just settlements. They're architectural marvels that took generations to complete. The precision is breathtaking. The buildings at Chaco Canyon are aligned with celestial events with astronomical accuracy that rivals modern observatories. The Great House at Pueblo Bonito contains over 600 rooms and rises 4 stories high. Its walls are built with such skill that they've stood for over 1,000 years without mortar. And here's something that might surprise you. These ancient builders had a sophisticated understanding of acoustics. Stand in the center of the Great Kiva at Casa Rinconada and whisper, and your voice will carry clearly to someone standing 50 feet away. They built concert halls into their religious spaces, understanding sound in ways that wouldn't be rediscovered until centuries later. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these civilizations wasn't their buildings, it was their agriculture. While Europeans were struggling with crop failures and famines, Native Americans had transformed their entire continent into a carefully managed G. The 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, weren't just crops, they were a revolutionary agricultural system. The corn stalks provided support for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil to feed the corn and squash. The squash leaves spread across the ground, preventing weeds and retaining moisture. Together, they produced more protein and nutrients per acre than European wheat fields. But it went far beyond the 3 sisters. Native Americans had domesticated over 70 different food plants. They created raised fields in swampy areas, terraced steep hillsides, and built irrigation systems that channeled water across vast distances. The Amazon rainforest itself was largely shaped by human hands. What Spanish explorers called virgin forest was actually a carefully managed ecosystem that had been cultivated for thousands of years. Terra preta, the incredibly fertile black earth found throughout the Amazon, wasn't natural. It was created by indigenous farmers who understood soil science in ways that modern agriculture is only beginning to appreciate. These soils are so rich that they're still more fertile than surrounding areas 500 years later. The scale of this transformation is almost impossible to comprehend. Conservative estimates suggest that Native Americans had altered the landscape of 2 entire continents. They had cleared forests, planted prairies, and managed wildlife populations through controlled burning. The pristine wilderness that European explorers thought they were discovering was actually the result of thousands of years of careful environmental management. And this brings us to one of the most shocking revelations of recent archaeological research. The Americas in 1491 weren't sparsely populated. They were bursting with people. Recent estimates suggest that the total population of the Americas before European contact may have been over 100 million people, more than the entire population of Europe at the time. Let that sink in for a moment. The Americas weren't empty, they were full. So where did all these people go? Why do most history books talk about Native Americans as if they were a handful of scattered tribes living in pristine wilderness? The answer to that question is one of the darkest chapters in human history, and it began on that peaceful night in 1491. But before we get to that tragedy, let's spend a little more time in this world that was, because understanding what was lost is crucial to understanding why it matters. Along the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States, the landscape was dramatically different from what European colonists would encounter a century later. The forests were more open, almost park-like, with large trees spaced far apart and clear sightlines for hundreds of yards. This wasn't natural. It was the result of controlled burning by Native Americans, who used fire as a tool to manage their environment. These fires served multiple purposes. They cleared underbrush, making travel easier and reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfires. They created habitat for game animals like deer and elk. And they promoted the growth of useful plants. Many of the berries, nuts, and medicinal plants that Native Americans relied on actually require periodic burning to thrive. The result was a landscape that seemed almost magical to European eyes. Captain John Smith described forests where a man may gallop a horse amongst these trees. William Penn wrote of woods so clear of undergrowth that they seemed like the most pleasant places in the world. They didn't understand that they were seeing the result of thousands of years of careful management. The same was true of the prairies of the Midwest. While textbooks often describe these grasslands as natural, recent research suggests that they were largely created and maintained by Native Americans through controlled burning. The great herds of buffalo that roamed these plains weren't just wild animals. They were part of a complex ecosystem that was actively managed by human beings. This challenges our entire understanding of what natural means. Were the Americas in 1491 more natural or less natural than they are today? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. What's clear is that Native Americans had developed sustainable ways of living that supported huge populations while maintaining environmental health. They had solved problems that we're still struggling with today. How to feed large numbers of people while preserving biodiversity. How to build cities that work with nature rather than against it. How to manage resources for the long term rather than just short-term profit. And they had done all of this while developing rich cultures that produced art, music, literature, and philosophy that rival anything created anywhere in the world. Take the Iroquois Confederacy, for example. Long before European philosophers were theorizing about democracy, the Haudenosaunee had created a sophisticated system of representative government that balanced power between different groups and emphasized the importance of making decisions for the benefit of 7 generations in the future. The Great Law of Peace, the constitution that governed the Confederacy, contained provisions for impeaching leaders who failed to serve the people's interests. It established a system of checks and balances between different branches of government. It even included a Bill of Rights that protected individual freedoms. Benjamin Franklin studied this system carefully, and many historians believe it influenced the development of the U.S. Constitution. The Albany Plan of Union, which Franklin proposed in 1754, was explicitly modeled on the Iroquois Confederacy. When the Founding Fathers were struggling to create a system that could unite 13 different colonies, they looked to Native Americans who had already solved the problem of uniting different nations under one government while preserving their individual identities. But perhaps the most radical aspect of many Native American societies was their approach to gender roles. While European women in 1491 had virtually no legal rights and were considered the property of their fathers or husbands, many Native American societies were matrilineal, with women holding significant political and economic power. Among the Iroquois, women owned all the property and chose the chiefs. If a chief failed to represent the people's interests, the clan mothers could remove him from office. Children belonged to their mother's clan, not their father's, and when a man married, he moved in with his wife's family. This wasn't unusual. Across North America, many societies gave women roles and respect that wouldn't be matched in European cultures for centuries. Cherokee women could own property, initiate divorce, and serve as war chiefs. Lakota women could become medicine people and spiritual leaders. Hopi women owned the houses and fields, and children took their clan membership from their mothers. The diversity of Native American societies is staggering. They spoke over 300 different languages, more linguistic diversity than existed in all of Europe. They had developed dozens of different forms of government, from the democratic confederacies of the Northeast to the complex chiefdoms of the Southeast to the egalitarian bands of the Great Basin. Some were farmers, some were hunters, some were fishers. Some lived in permanent cities, others moved seasonally to take advantage of different resources. Some built massive monuments that still stand today. Others left barely a trace on the landscape. Some were peaceful traders, others were fierce warriors. Some worshipped a single great spirit, others honored hundreds of different deities. What they all shared was a deep understanding of their environment and sophisticated ways of living sustainably within it. They had learned to read the subtle signs of weather and seasons, to predict the movements of animals and the cycles of plants, to find food and medicine and materials for shelter and clothing from the natural world around them. And on that peaceful night in 1491, all of this knowledge, all of this wisdom, all of these millions of lives and thousands of cultures were about to face the greatest challenge in human history. Because while families in countless villages across 2 continents were settling down for the night, completely unaware of what was coming, 3 small ships were making their way across the Atlantic Ocean. Their captain was a man named Cristoforo Colombo, Christopher Columbus, and he was lost. He thought he was sailing to Asia. He had no idea that he was about to stumble upon 2 entire continents that Europeans didn't even know existed. He had no idea that he was about to trigger a chain of events that would transform the entire world. And neither did the millions of people settling down for what they thought would be just another peaceful night in their villages. They had no way of knowing that their world was about to end. Let's zoom in now, from the continental view to something more intimate. Let's visit one particular village on that last night of the old world. While we can't know exactly which villages were experiencing their final peaceful evening, archaeological evidence and historical accounts allow us to reconstruct what life might have looked like in a typical Native American community on the eve of contact. We'll call it Kitanawa, place of many stories. In one of the Algonquian languages, it sits on the banks of a river that will one day be renamed by Europeans, in a valley that will one day be divided by state lines that don't exist yet. Tonight, though, it's simply home to about 300 people who have no idea they're about to become part of history. The village is laid out in a rough circle, with the larger family lodges toward the center and smaller structures scattered around the periphery. Gardens stretch out from the village in all directions, the three sisters growing together in mounds, supplemented by sunflowers, tobacco, and dozens of other plants that have been carefully selected and bred over generations. The main fire in the central plaza burned down to glowing coals hours ago, but smoke still rises lazily into the star-filled sky. A few elders sit nearby, their voices low as they discuss the day's events and plan for tomorrow's tasks. Children have long since been tucked into their beds, but some of the teenagers are still awake, whispering and giggling in the darkness. In one of the lodges, a woman named Ayana sits by a small fire, working on a piece of beadwork by the flickering light. Her fingers move with practiced skill, creating intricate patterns that tell stories. The migration of her people to this place, the adventures of culture heroes, the cycles of the seasons. Each bead is perfectly placed, each color chosen for its meaning. This isn't just craftwork. This is literature, history, and art all woven together. The patterns Ayana is creating carry information that has been passed down through generations. They serve as memory aids for stories that teach important lessons about how to live, how to treat others, how to maintain harmony with the natural world. In another lodge, her brother Nakoma is sharpening tools by the firelight. Tomorrow he'll lead a hunting party into the hills to track the deer that have been browsing in the valley. He knows their habits as well as he knows his own family, where they feed, where they sleep, which trails they use to move between their summer and winter ranges. This knowledge wasn't learned from books or schools. It was passed down from his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather, refined through countless generations of observation and experience. Nakoma can read tracks in mud or snow, like others read words on a page. He can predict the weather by the behavior of birds and the smell of the wind. But he's not just a hunter. Like most people in Kitanawa, he has multiple skills and roles. He's also a storyteller, a maker of tools, a keeper of certain ceremonial knowledge. In a world without written language, every person is a living library, carrying irreplaceable information in their mem. The children sleeping peacefully in their beds tonight are already learning these skills. 5-year-old Kaya can identify dozens of edible plants and knows which ones are ready to harvest in each season. 7-year-old Ahanu can track small animals and knows how to set snares without damaging their pelts. 10-year-old Istas helps her mother tan hides and is learning the complex process of making the fine white buckskin that their family is known for. This education doesn't happen in classrooms. It's woven into daily life, passed along through stories and songs, learned through careful observation and patient practice. By the time these children are adults, they'll possess knowledge that took thousands of years to accumulate. and it's knowledge that works. The people of Kitanawa are healthy and well-fed. They have effective treatments for common ailments, sophisticated techniques for preserving food, and detailed understanding of their local environment. They live in harmony with the seasonal cycles, taking what they need from nature while ensuring that there will be enough for future generations. Their political system is based on consensus rather than coercion. Decisions are made through long discussions where everyone's voice is heard and respected. Leaders are chosen for their wisdom and ability to serve others, not for their power or wealth. Conflicts are resolved through careful negotiation and, when necessary, ritual combat that minimizes actual harm. They have rich spiritual lives that integrate the sacred and the everyday. Every activity, hunting, farming, cooking, crafting, has its spiritual dimension. They understand themselves to be part of a web of relationships that includes not just other humans, but animals, plants, rivers, mountains, and celestial bodies. Tonight, as they settle down to sleep, many offer prayers of gratitude for the day's blessings and ask for guidance and protection in the days to come. They pray for their families, their community, their ancestors, and the generations yet to be born. They pray for the animals they depend on, the plants that feed them, the rain that waters their crops. They have no way of knowing that these prayers are about to become desperately necessary. Because while the people of Kitanawa sleep peacefully, unaware that their world is about to change forever, ships are already sailing toward their shores. Not Columbus's 3 vessels. That moment has already passed. But other ships, carrying other explorers, other conquistadors, other colonizers. And with these ships comes something far more deadly than swords or guns or horses. Something invisible. Something the people of Kitanawa have never encountered before and have no defense against. Something that will kill more Native Americans than all the wars, all the forced removals, all the broken treaties combined. Disease. The people of Kitanawa, like Native Americans everywhere, have been isolated from the Old World for over 15,000 years. In that time, they've developed immunity to the diseases that exist in the Americas, but they have no resistance to the pathogens that evolved alongside humans and domestic animals in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Smallpox, measles, typhus, bubonic plague, influenza, tuberculosis. These diseases, which Old World populations had developed some resistance to over thousands of years of exposure, are about to encounter populations with no immunity at all. The result will be catastrophic beyond imagination. Within a century of first contact, an estimated 90% of the Native American population will be dead. Not from war, not from slavery, not from forced removal, though all of those horrors will play their part, but from disease. This is why the pristine wilderness that later European colonists thought they were encountering was actually a post-apocalyptic landscape. The forests had grown back over abandoned fields. The grasslands had returned to areas that had once been villages and cities. The wildlife populations had exploded in the absence of the human management that had kept them in balance for thousands of years. By the time the Mayflower arrived in 1620, the Great Dying was already largely over. The colonists were settling in a land that had been emptied by plague. They found cleared fields and freshwater springs and strategic high ground, not because the land was naturally suited for settlement, but because other people had already lived there and chosen those spots for the same reasons. But on this night in 1491, none of that has happened yet. The people of Kitanawa sleep peacefully, surrounded by their loved ones, secure in their knowledge that tomorrow will be much like today. that the old ways will continue, that their children and grandchildren will live the same life they've known, following the same cycles, telling the same stories, honoring the same traditions. It's a peace that will be shattered soon enough. But for now, tonight, it's real. The children dream safely in their beds. The adults rest, knowing they've done their work well and provided for their families. The elders sit by the dying fires, sharing the wisdom of ages with those who will carry it forward. The dawn that breaks over Kitanawa looks exactly like every other dawn for the past 1,000 years. The sun rises in the east, painting the sky in familiar shades of pink and gold. Birds begin their morning songs. The river murmurs softly, as it has since time immemorial. But something is different. Something that the people of Kitanawa can't see or hear or smell, but that will change everything. Because on this morning, for the first time in 15,000 years, two worlds are about to meet. The actual first encounters between Native Americans and Europeans varied dramatically depending on when and where they happened. Columbus's landing in the Caribbean in 1492 was just the beginning. Over the following decades, Spanish conquistadors would arrive in Mexico and South America. Portuguese explorers would reach Brazil. French fishermen would begin visiting the coasts of what would become Canada. English explorers would probe the eastern seaboard of North America. Each of these encounters was unique, shaped by the specific cultures that came into contact, the motivations of the Europeans involved, and the particular circumstances of the meeting. But certain patterns emerge when we look at these first contacts as a whole. Patterns that help us understand what happened to villages like our fictional Kitanawa all across the Americas. Let's start with what might seem like the most famous first encounter, though it's actually not representative of most Native American experiences with Europeans. When Columbus landed in the Bahamas on October 12, 1492, he encountered the Taino people, who he described in his journal as very well-built people, with handsome bodies and very fine faces. What's striking about Columbus's initial observations is how positive they were. The Taino, he wrote, were generous and peaceful. They shared their food and possessions freely. They were skilled craftspeople who made beautiful objects from gold, cotton, and wood. They had developed sophisticated agricultural techniques and lived in well-organized villages led by chiefs called caciques. Columbus was particularly impressed by their intelligence and adaptability. Within hours of first contact, some Taino had learned Spanish words and were serving as interpreters. They quickly understood what the Spanish were looking for and offered to guide them to sources of gold and other valuable materials. But Columbus's admiration was tainted by something darker. In that same journal entry, where he praised the Taino's beauty and intelligence, he also wrote that they ought to be good and intelligent servants. For I see that they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. From the very beginning, Europeans weren't just meeting Native Americans as fellow human beings. They were evaluating them as potential servants, slaves, and sources of wealth. Even when individual Europeans genuinely admired Native American cultures, they were doing so within a framework that assumed European superiority and the right to exploit indigenous peoples. This attitude was shaped by European experiences with other cultures, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, where centuries of conflict had already established patterns of conquest, conversion, and exploitation. Europeans arrived in the Americas with preconceived notions about how to deal with primitive peoples, and they applied these templates even when they clearly didn't fit the sophisticated civilizations they actually encountered. The Spanish, in particular, brought with them the Reconquista mentality, the idea that conquest and conversion were not just acceptable, but divinely mandated. For nearly 800 years, Spanish Christians had been fighting to drive Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, developing a crusading ideology that justified taking land and resources from infidels. When they arrived in the Americas, they simply transferred this worldview to Native Americans. The result was the Requerimiento, a document that Spanish conquistadors were required to read aloud to indigenous peoples before attacking them. This bizarre legal ritual informed Native Americans that they were now subjects of the Spanish crown and must convert to Christianity. If they refused, the Spanish were legally justified in waging war against them, enslaving them, and taking their property. Of course, the Requerimiento was usually read in Spanish to people who couldn't understand the language, and often the Spanish didn't even bother to find translators. Sometimes they read it to empty villages or even to trees. The point wasn't actually to communicate with Native Americans. It was to create a legal justification for conquest that would satisfy Spanish courts and clergy back home. But not all first encounters followed this pattern of immediate hostility and exploitation. In many cases, the initial meetings between Europeans and Native Americans were genuinely peaceful and mutually beneficial. French explorers and traders, for example, generally took a very different approach than the Spanish conquistadors. They were more interested in trade than conquest, and they quickly realized that maintaining good relationships with Native Americans was essential for their economic success. The French fur trade depended on Native American knowledge, skills, and labor. Indigenous peoples knew where to find the best furs, how to trap and process animals, and how to navigate the vast networks of rivers and lakes that served as highways through the North American wilderness. French traders who treated Native Americans as partners rather than subjects were much more successful than those who tried to dominate or exploit them. This led to a very different kind of first encounter. Instead of conquest and conversion, there was mutual curiosity and gradual relationship building. French traders learned Native American languages and customs. They married Native American women and had children who grew up bicultural. They participated in indigenous ceremonies and sometimes adopted Native American religious practices alongside their Catholic faith. The result was the emergence of Métis communities, mixed-race populations that blended European and Native American cultures in new and innovative ways. These communities developed their own languages, their own customs, their own ways of understanding the world that drew from both traditions. But even these more positive encounters came with hidden dangers. Because while French traders might respect Native American cultures and form genuine friendships with indigenous peoples, they were still carriers of old world diseases. Smallpox, measles, and other pathogens spread along trade routes just as efficiently as they spread along conquest routes. And this brings us to the most tragic aspect of first contact, the biological exchange that historians call the Columbian Exchange. But that, from a Native American perspective, was nothing less than a biological holocaust. The statistics are staggering and almost impossible to comprehend. Scholars estimate that the population of the Americas before 1492 was somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. By 1600, that population had collapsed to perhaps 5 or 6 million. In just over a century, roughly 90% of all Native Americans had died. To put this in perspective, imagine if 90% of everyone you know suddenly died. Imagine if 9 out of every 10 buildings in your city were abandoned. Imagine if the highways were empty, the schools were closed, the hospitals had no patients. That's what happened to the Americas in the century after first contact. The primary cause wasn't warfare, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't slavery, though millions of Native Americans were enslaved. It wasn't forced removal. though that would come later. The primary cause was disease. Native Americans had been isolated from the Old World for so long that they had no immunity to European, African, and Asian diseases. When these pathogens arrived, they spread like wildfire through populations that had no biological defenses against them. Smallpox was particularly devastating. The disease killed 30% of the people who contracted it in European populations that had some immunity. In Native American populations with no immunity, the death rate was often 90% or higher. But smallpox wasn't the only killer. Measles, typhus, bubonic plague, influenza, tuberculosis, whooping cough, malaria, yellow fever, all of these diseases and many others ravaged Native American communities. Often, multiple diseases would strike the same community simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of mortality. The social effects were as devastating as the biological ones. In many Native American societies, knowledge was passed down orally from elders to younger generations. When diseases killed most of the elders, entire bodies of knowledge, languages, stories, ceremonies, practical skills died with them. Imagine if 90% of all the libraries, museums, schools, and universities in your country suddenly disappeared, taking with them most of the accumulated knowledge of your civilization. That's what happened to Native American cultures across the Americas. Some communities simply ceased to exist. Entire villages were found empty, with nothing but skeletons to show where vibrant communities had once thrived. The psychological impact was equally severe. In many Native American worldviews, disease and disaster were understood as signs of spiritual imbalance or divine displeasure. When traditional healing methods failed against European diseases, it created a crisis of faith that made some communities more vulnerable to European religious conversion. Spanish missionaries in particular were quick to interpret the devastating impact of European diseases as evidence of Christian God's power over indigenous deities. They told Native Americans that the diseases were punishment for their heathen beliefs, and that conversion to Christianity was the only way to save themselves and their children. This created a cruel irony. The very diseases that Europeans had inadvertently brought to the Americas became tools of cultural conquest, used to undermine Native American religious beliefs and facilitate European colonization. But even in the face of this unprecedented disaster, Native American communities showed remarkable resilience and adaptability. Many groups reorganized themselves, developing new ways of surviving in a radically changed world. They formed new alliances, adopted new technologies, and found ways to maintain their cultural identities, even as their populations collapsed. Some communities, particularly those in areas that Europeans were slow to penetrate, managed to avoid the worst of the epidemics. Others recovered more quickly, developing some immunity to European diseases and rebuilding their populations. Still others found ways to use the chaos of the colonial period to their advantage, playing European powers against each other, or carving out new roles as intermediaries in the emerging colonial economy. The story of first contact between Europeans and Native Americans is not just a story of conquest and catastrophe. It's also a story of survival, adaptation, and cultural continuity in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a story of human resilience that continues to this day. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, we're still in that moment of first encounter, when two worlds that had developed in isolation for 15,000 years suddenly came face to face. Let's return to our fictional village of Kitanawa to imagine what that moment might have felt like for the people who lived through it. It's been several weeks since that peaceful night we visited earlier. The seasons are beginning to change, and the people of Kitanawa are busy with the harvest. The corn is ready to be picked, the beans are heavy on the vines, and the squash are growing fat in the fields. Children run between the garden plots, helping their parents and grandparents bring in the crops that will sustain the community through the winter. There's laughter and conversation as families work together, and a sense of satisfaction that comes from another successful growing season. But then someone notices something strange on the horizon. Smoke rising from a distant hill, but not the familiar smoke of controlled burning or cooking fires. This smoke is darker, more chaotic, and it's coming from the direction of their neighbor's village. A party of young warriors is sent to investigate. They return hours later with news that shakes the community to its core. The neighboring village is gone, not destroyed by fire or flood or enemy attack, but simply empty. Houses standing intact but abandoned, crops rotting in the fields, and in some of the lodges, they found bodies of people who seemed to have died from some unknown sickness. This is how the New World announced itself to many Native American communities, not through direct contact with Europeans, but through the collapse of neighboring communities as diseases spread along trade routes and social networks, faster than the Europeans themselves could travel. Over the following weeks, more disturbing reports arrive. Villages to the south have been abandoned. Trading parties have failed to arrive at their usual times. And some of the people in Kitanawa itself have begun to show symptoms of a strange illness: fever, weakness, and a rash that spreads across the skin. The community's healers try everything they know, but their traditional medicines seem powerless against this new sickness. People who were healthy and strong just days before become bedridden and then die with shocking speed. Children are particularly vulnerable, and the sound of mourning fills the village day and night. As more and more people fall ill, the careful social structures that have sustained Kitanawa for generations begin to break down. There aren't enough healthy adults to tend the crops, care for the sick, or maintain the daily routines that keep the community functioning. And then, just when it seems like things can't get worse, strangers appear at the edge of the village. Men with pale skin and strange clothes, riding animals that no one in Kitanawa has ever seen before. They carry metal tools and weapons that gleam in the sunlight, and they speak in a language that sounds harsh and alien to Native American ears. The moment of first contact has finally arrived, but instead of the meeting between two healthy, confident civilizations that it might have been just a few months earlier, it's now an encounter between confused, desperate survivors and foreign invaders who may not even realize the role they've played in the catastrophe that's unfolding around them. This is the true story of first contact between Europeans and Native Americans. Not the romanticized version of mutual curiosity and cultural exchange that sometimes appears in history books, but a desperate struggle for survival in the face of biological and cultural catastrophe. And this is just the beginning, because while the great dying of the 16th and 17th centuries was the most immediate and devastating impact of European colonization, it was followed by centuries of warfare, forced removal, cultural suppression, and systematic attempts to erase Native American identities entirely. The peaceful night we began with wasn't just the end of pre-Columbian America. It was the last night of a world where Native Americans could take for granted that their children would grow up speaking their languages, practicing their traditions, and living on the lands of their ancestors. Everything that happened after would be shaped by loss, resistance, and the struggle to maintain indigenous identities in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. What happened next defies the imagination. In the span of a single human lifetime, entire civilizations simply vanished from the earth. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned. Languages that had been spoken for millennia fell silent forever. Knowledge that had taken thousands of years to accumulate disappeared as if it had never existed. This was the Great Dying, the largest demographic catastrophe in human history. And most people have never heard of it. To understand the scale of what happened, let's start with some numbers that scholars have painstakingly assembled from archaeological evidence, historical records, and population genetics. Before 1492, the Americas were home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. The exact number is debated, but even the most conservative estimates put the pre-contact population at over 50 million. By 1650, that number had collapsed to perhaps 6 million. In 150 years, roughly 90% of all Native Americans had died. To put this in global perspective, this was a larger percentage loss than Europe suffered during the Black Death, and it happened to a population that was initially much larger than Europe's. But numbers alone can't capture the human reality of what this meant. Let's return to our fictional village of Kitanawa to imagine how this catastrophe might have unfolded at the community level. The first death seemed almost random. A child would wake up with a fever and be dead within days. An elderly person who had been healthy and active would suddenly weaken and never recover. A young hunter would return from a successful trip feeling fine, then collapse before he could even share his kill with his family. At first, the community's healers tried their traditional remedies. They made teas from medicinal plants, performed cleansing ceremonies, and called upon the spirits for guidance, but nothing worked. The strange new sickness seemed immune to all their knowledge and power. As more people fell ill, patterns began to emerge that made no sense according to traditional Native American understanding of disease. Usually, the very young and very old were most vulnerable to sickness, while healthy adults had the best chance of survival. But this new disease seemed to target everyone equally, or even worse, it seemed to kill the strongest adults while sometimes sparing the weakest children. This wasn't just medically baffling, it was spiritually devastating. In many Native American worldviews, illness was understood as a sign of spiritual imbalance that could be corrected through proper ceremonies and behavior. When the most respected elders and the most skilled healers began dying alongside everyone else, it created a crisis of faith that was almost as destructive as the disease itself. Within weeks, Kitanawa's population had been cut in half. Within months, only a few dozen survivors remained out of the 300 people who had lived there just a season before. The careful social structures that had sustained the community for generations collapsed under the weight of constant death and grief. There weren't enough healthy adults to maintain the gardens that fed the community. The corn stood unharvested in the fields while the surviving children went hungry. There weren't enough hunters to provide meat for the winter. There weren't enough elders to teach the young people the skills they would need to survive. Most tragically of all, there weren't enough people left who remembered the stories, songs, and ceremonies that defined who they were as a people. The oral traditions that had been passed down for countless generations were dying along with the people who carried them. Ayana, the woman we met on that peaceful night months earlier, was among the survivors. But the intricate beadwork that had once told the stories of her people now seemed pointless. Who was left to read the patterns? Who would remember what they meant? Her brother Nakoma had died early in the epidemic, along with most of the other skilled hunters. The detailed knowledge of animal behavior and environmental signs that he had carried in his memory was gone forever. The trails he had known, the hunting grounds he had managed, the seasonal rounds that had sustained his family for generations, all of this practical wisdom died with him. The children who survived faced a future that was unimaginably different from anything their ancestors had experienced. They were growing up in a world where the basic assumptions of their culture no longer applied. The land that had once seemed full of relatives and resources now felt empty and alien. The spiritual practices that had once provided comfort and guidance now seemed powerless against the catastrophe that had befallen them. This pattern was repeated in thousands of communities across the Americas. Archaeological evidence shows village after village suddenly abandoned, with pottery still sitting on tables and tools still lying where they had been dropped. Entire regions that had once supported dense populations were left virtually uninhabited. In Mexico, the sophisticated city-states of the Aztec Empire collapsed almost overnight when smallpox arrived. Tenochtitlan, which had been one of the largest cities in the world, was reduced to ruins, not primarily by Spanish conquest, but by disease. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés described walking through streets lined with bodies, with nowhere to step without treading on the dead. The Inca Empire in South America suffered a similar fate. The highly organized administrative system that had held together millions of people across thousands of miles of difficult terrain simply fell apart when disease killed the nobles, priests, and skilled administrators who made it function. In North America, the great trading networks that had connected communities from the Atlantic to the Pacific were severed as the populations that maintained them died or scattered. The sophisticated agricultural systems that had supported large populations were abandoned as there weren't enough people left to maintain them. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the Great Dying wasn't just the loss of life. It was the loss of knowledge. Native American societies were primarily oral cultures, which meant that information was stored in people's memories rather than written down. When people died, their knowledge died with them. Imagine if 90% of all the books, computers, and storage devices in the modern world suddenly disappeared, taking with them most of human knowledge about science, technology, history, and culture. That's roughly equivalent to what happened to Native American societies during the Great Dying. Languages that had taken thousands of years to evolve disappeared in a single generation when there weren't enough speakers left to pass them on to children. Complex ceremonies that required the participation of many specialized individuals could no longer be performed when most of those individuals were dead. Traditional ecological knowledge that had enabled Native Americans to manage their environments sustainably for millennia was lost as the elders who carried it died before they could train their successors. This loss of environmental knowledge had consequences that extended far beyond Native American communities. Without human management, many ecosystems began to change in ways that made them less suitable for the plants and animals that had adapted to indigenous management practices. Forests that had been kept open by controlled burning became overgrown and prone to catastrophic wildfires. Prairie ecosystems that had been maintained by careful timing of burns and grazing began to revert to woodland. Some species that had been carefully managed by Native Americans actually went extinct during this period. The passenger pigeon, which had once existed in flocks of billions, may have been dependent on the large-scale forest management practices of indigenous peoples. When those practices ceased due to population collapse, the passenger pigeon lost its habitat and eventually disappeared entirely. Other species exploded in population when the human management that had kept them in check disappeared. Deer populations, for example, grew dramatically in many areas after Native American hunting pressure was removed. This led to overgrazing that changed forest composition and affected other wildlife species. European colonists, arriving decades or centuries after the initial epidemics, often interpreted these ecological changes as evidence that the Americas had always been a pristine wilderness with few human inhabitants. They had no way of knowing that they were seeing the aftermath of the greatest environmental and demographic catastrophe in human history. This misunderstanding has persisted in American culture and education to this day. The idea of pre-Columbian America as an empty wilderness populated by a few scattered tribes is not just historically inaccurate. It's the direct result of European colonists encountering a post-apocalyptic landscape and mistaking it for a natural one. The reality is that by the time most European colonization began in earnest, the worst of the Great Dying was already over. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 were settling in an area that had been densely populated just a few decades earlier. The cleared fields they found and claimed as evidence of divine providence were actually the abandoned farms of Patuxet people who had died in a plague that swept through the region between 1616 and 1619. Squanto, the Patuxet man who famously helped the Plymouth colonists survive their first winter, was able to speak English not because he was naturally gifted with languages, but because he had been kidnapped by English slave traders years earlier, sold into slavery in Spain, escaped, made his way to London, and finally returned home, only to find his entire community dead and his homeland empty. The corn he taught the Pilgrims to grow, the fishing and hunting techniques he shared with them, the diplomatic connections he helped them make with surviving Native American communities, all of this knowledge came from a sophisticated culture that had been virtually wiped out by disease before the Mayflower ever left England. This pattern of European colonists settling in areas that had been depopulated by earlier epidemics was repeated across the Americas. It's one of the reasons why European colonization was able to proceed as quickly and successfully as it did. In many cases, colonists weren't conquering inhabited territories. They were moving into lands that had been emptied by biological catastrophe. But the Great Dying wasn't just a one-time event that happened in the immediate aftermath of first contact. Waves of epidemic disease continued to sweep through Native American populations for centuries, often triggered by renewed contact with Europeans or by the introduction of new pathogens. Each new epidemic would undo years or decades of population recovery. Communities that had begun to rebuild after previous catastrophes would be devastated again, sometimes repeatedly. This created a cycle of demographic collapse and partial recovery that continued well into the 19th century in some areas. The psychological and cultural impacts of living under this constant threat were profound. Imagine growing up in a world where a new plague might arrive at any moment, killing most of your family and community. Imagine trying to maintain cultural traditions when you never know if there will be enough people left to perform them next year. Some communities developed what historians call survivor syndrome, a fatalistic acceptance of demographic catastrophe that made it difficult to plan for the future or invest in long-term cultural projects. Why teach a child the complex skills needed to be a master craftsperson if that child might die before reaching adulthood? Why maintain elaborate ceremonies if there might not be enough people left to perform them? Other communities responded by becoming more flexible and adaptive, finding new ways to maintain their identities even as their numbers fluctuated dramatically. They developed simplified versions of complex traditions, created new ceremonies that required fewer participants, and found ways to preserve essential knowledge in forms that could survive demographic catastrophe. These adaptive strategies often involved increased interaction and intermarriage with other Native American groups, creating new hybrid communities that blended traditions from multiple cultures. While this adaptation enabled survival, it also meant that many distinct tribal identities were lost as smaller groups merged with larger ones. The Great Dying also had profound impacts on European colonization patterns and colonial societies. In areas where Native American populations had been completely eliminated, European settlers could establish themselves without having to negotiate with indigenous peoples or adapt to existing social and economic systems. But in areas where Native American communities had survived, even in reduced numbers, the dynamics of colonization were very different. Europeans had to find ways to coexist with indigenous peoples who still had claims to the land and knowledge of how to survive in local conditions. This often led to the emergence of middle ground societies, where European and Native American cultures blended in complex ways. French traders in the Great Lakes region, for example, often adopted Native American customs and languages, while Native Americans incorporated European goods and technologies into their traditional ways of life. These hybrid societies were often more successful than purely European colonies, precisely because they were able to draw on indigenous knowledge and maintain relationships with surviving Native American communities. But they were also more complex and harder to control from European capitals, which led to ongoing tensions between colonial authorities and local populations. The genetic legacy of the Great Dying can still be detected in Native American populations today. Studies of mitochondrial DNA show dramatic reductions in genetic diversity that correspond to the period of epidemic diseases. Entire genetic lineages that had existed for thousands. On one hand, the memory of such devastating loss creates intergenerational trauma that affects Native American communities to this day. Rates of depression, suicide, and substance abuse in many Native American communities can be traced in part to the historical trauma of the Great Dying and its aftermath. On the other hand, the fact that Native American cultures survived at all despite such overwhelming catastrophe demonstrates remarkable resilience and adaptability. Communities that maintained their identities through centuries of demographic collapse, forced removal, cultural suppression, and systematic attempts at assimilation have proven their ability to endure almost anything. This history of survival against impossible odds has become a source of cultural pride and political strength for contemporary Native American movements. When modern indigenous activists assert their rights to land, sovereignty, and cultural preservation, they're drawing on a legacy of resistance that stretches back to the very beginning of the colonial period. The Great Dying was not just a historical tragedy. It was a foundational event that shaped everything that came after. The emptied landscapes that European colonists settled, the virgin soil epidemics that continued to devastate Native American communities throughout the colonial period, the demographic imbalances that made European military conquest possible, the cultural disruptions that facilitated religious conversion and political domination. All of these colonial phenomena can be traced back to the biological catastrophe that began in 1492. Understanding the Great Dying is essential to understanding American history, but it's been largely ignored in mainstream education and popular culture. Most Americans learn about the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock, but they never learn about the plague that emptied the land the Pilgrims settled. They learn about westward expansion and manifest destiny, but they never learn about the demographic catastrophe that made that expansion possible. This historical amnesia isn't accidental. Acknowledging the scale of the Great Dying would require confronting some uncomfortable truths about the foundations of American society. It would mean admitting that European colonization was made possible not primarily by superior technology or culture, but by biological catastrophe that reduced Native American populations to a tiny fraction of their pre-contact levels. It would also require acknowledging that the empty wilderness that European colonists thought they were settling was actually a post-apocalyptic landscape created by the largest demographic catastrophe in human history. The virgin land that Americans celebrated in their founding myths was actually a graveyard. But there's another reason why the Great Dying has been forgotten, and it has to do with the nature of oral cultures themselves. Because Native American societies primarily passed down knowledge through spoken traditions rather than written records, much of the story of the Great Dying died along with the people who experienced it. The survivors were often too few and too traumatized to maintain detailed historical accounts. Children who grew up in the aftermath of the epidemics had no way of knowing what their communities had been like before the catastrophe. The magnitude of what had been lost was literally beyond their ability to comprehend or remember. European colonists, for their part, had little interest in documenting the societies they were displacing. Most colonial writers focused on justifying European presence in the Americas, rather than accurately describing pre-existing indigenous societies. When they did write about Native Americans, they often portrayed them as primitive peoples living in harmony with nature, rather than as survivors of a recent catastrophe. This combination of indigenous historical amnesia and European historical distortion created a version of American history that largely erased the Great Dying from collective memory. By the time professional historians began trying to reconstruct pre-Columbian demographics in the 20th century, most of the evidence had already been lost. What remains is fragmentary. Archaeological sites that show sudden abandonment, genetic studies that reveal population bottlenecks, early colonial accounts that describe empty lands and scattered survivors. From these fragments, scholars have painstakingly reconstructed the story of the Great Dying, but it remains largely unknown outside of academic circles. This historical invisibility has had profound consequences for how Americans understand their past and present. If you don't know that 90% of Native Americans died in the century after European contact, you can't understand why Native American communities today are so small and struggling. If you don't know that most of North America was densely populated before 1492, you can't understand the true impact of European colonization. If you don't know about the Great Dying, you might think that European technological and cultural superiority explains the success of colonization. You might believe that Native Americans were naturally primitive peoples who were inevitably displaced by more advanced civilizations. You might see American expansion as natural and inevitable, rather than as the result of specific historical circumstances. But if you do know about the Great Dying, the entire story of American history looks different. European colonization appears not as the triumph of civilization over wilderness, but as settlement in the ruins of a demographic catastrophe. Native American primitiveness appears not as natural inferiority, but as the result of cultural collapse caused by unprecedented mortality. The survival of any Native American communities at all appears not as evidence of European mercy or benevolence, but as testimony to indigenous resilience in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. And contemporary Native American struggles for rights, recognition, and resources appear not as complaints from a marginal minority, but as the continuing effects of the largest genocide in human history. This is why the story of the Great Dying matters, not just as historical knowledge, but as a foundation for understanding the America we live in today. The peaceful night in that Native American village that we began with wasn't just the end of pre-Columbian America. It was the last night of a world that most Americans have never imagined existed. What came after was not just conquest and colonization, but survival and resistance in the face of unimaginable loss. And that story of survival is still being written today in the Native American communities that have endured despite everything history has thrown at them. In the face of catastrophe that would have destroyed most civilizations completely, something remarkable happened. Native American communities didn't just survive. They adapted, evolved, and found ways to maintain their identities while navigating a completely transformed world. The story of how they did this is one of the most inspiring examples of human resilience in all of history. Let's return one more time to our fictional village of Kitanawa. But now, we're jumping forward several decades. The community that once numbered 300 people now has perhaps 30 survivors, scattered across a landscape that looks very different from the one their grandparents knew. Some of these survivors have joined other communities, carrying with them fragments of Kitanawa's traditions and knowledge. Others have remained on their ancestral territory, but they've had to completely reimagine how to live there. The old ways of organizing society, managing resources, and maintaining culture simply don't work when your population has been reduced by 90%. Ayana is now an elder herself, one of the few people left who remembers the world before the Great Sickness came. The intricate beadwork that once seemed pointless has become precious beyond measure. It's one of the few remaining links to the knowledge and stories of her people. But she's not just preserving the old ways, she's also creating new ones. Working with survivors from other communities, she's developing simplified versions of complex ceremonies that can be performed by smaller numbers of people. She's teaching children songs that blend traditional melodies with new words that describe their changed circumstances. Most importantly, she's finding ways to maintain the essential elements of her people's identity while adapting to radically different conditions. The specific practices may have changed, but the underlying values, respect for elders, care for children, harmony with the natural world, responsibility to future generations, these continue. This pattern of adaptive survival was repeated throughout the Americas. Native American communities demonstrated a remarkable ability to maintain their core identities while dramatically transforming their external practices. They developed new forms of government that could function with smaller populations. They created new economic systems that could survive in a world dominated by European trade networks. They found new ways to practice their religions in secret when European authorities tried to suppress them. One of the most important survival strategies was the formation of new alliances and confederations. Communities that had once been enemies or strangers found themselves cooperating for mutual survival. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, became even stronger during the colonial period as smaller groups joined the alliance for protection and mutual support. These alliances weren't just military, they were cultural and economic as well. Communities shared knowledge, resources, and people in ways that helped everyone survive. A community that had lost its healers might adopt healing practices from neighbors. A group that had lost its craftspeople might learn new skills from allies. Children who had been orphaned might be adopted by completely different tribes, carrying their original cultural knowledge into new communities. This flexibility and adaptability were actually traditional Native American values that served communities well during the crisis of colonization. Many indigenous societies had always been relatively fluid, with individuals and families moving between communities based on marriage, adoption, or personal choice. This cultural flexibility became a crucial survival mechanism when demographic catastrophe forced communities to reorganize themselves completely. Native American communities also demonstrated remarkable creativity in finding ways to benefit from European contact while maintaining their independence. They became skilled at playing European powers against each other, allying with the French against the English, or with the English against the Spanish, depending on what served their interests best. They selectively adopted European technologies that enhanced their traditional ways of life, while rejecting changes that threatened their cultural values. Horses, for example, were enthusiastically adopted by Plains tribes because they made hunting buffalo much more efficient. Metal tools were widely adopted because they made traditional crafts easier and more precise. But Native Americans were not passive recipients of European technology. They actively modified and improved European innovations to suit their own needs and preferences. Native American gunsmiths became renowned for their ability to repair and modify firearms. Indigenous horse breeders developed new breeds that were better suited to local conditions than European horses. This selective adoption and adaptation of European elements, while maintaining indigenous identities, became known as creative resistance. Instead of simply rejecting everything European or accepting everything European, Native American communities found ways to take what was useful while preserving what was essential. Perhaps nowhere was this creative resistance more evident than in the realm of religion. When European missionaries arrived preaching Christianity, many Native American communities didn't simply convert or reject the new religion. Instead, they found ways to blend Christian and indigenous elements into new synthetic belief systems. The result was a rich variety of syncretic religions that satisfied European demands for conversion, while allowing Native Americans to continue practicing essential elements of their traditional beliefs. Christian saints were identified with indigenous spirits. Biblical stories were reinterpreted through native cultural lenses. Christian holidays were celebrated with traditional indigenous ceremonies. This religious syncretism wasn't just a survival strategy. It was a creative theological innovation that produced genuinely new forms of spiritual expression. The Longhouse religion of the Iroquois, the Native American church that uses peyote in its ceremonies, and the various forms of indigenous Christianity that exist today all emerged from this process of creative adaptation. But survival and adaptation weren't always peaceful processes. Native American communities also engaged in active military resistance to European encroachment. And some of these conflicts became legendary examples of indigenous military prowess. King Philip's War in New England in the 1670s was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history relative to population size. Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, led a coalition of Native American tribes in a desperate attempt to halt English expansion. Although ultimately unsuccessful, the war demonstrated that Native American communities could still mount formidable military resistance even after their populations had been devastated by disease. Pontiac's rebellion in the 1760s saw a coalition of tribes in the Great Lakes region successfully capture multiple British forts and nearly drive the British out of the region entirely. The conflict demonstrated sophisticated military planning and coordination among tribes that Europeans had assumed were incapable of unified action. The Northwest Indian War of the 1790s resulted in some of the most significant Native American military victories in history. The defeat of General Arthur St. Clair's army by a confederacy of tribes led by Little Turtle was one of the worst military disasters in U.S. history, with over 900 American soldiers killed or wounded. These conflicts weren't just military campaigns. They were struggles over fundamentally different visions of how people should live on the land. Europeans generally viewed land as property that could be bought, sold, and exclusively controlled by individual owners. Native Americans generally viewed land as a shared resource that belonged to all living things and could not be permanently owned by any individual or group. This conflict over land philosophy would continue throughout the colonial and early national periods, leading to countless treaties that were made and broken as European and later American demand for land continued to grow. Native American communities found themselves forced to choose between armed resistance, which usually ended in defeat, and accommodation, which usually meant giving up more and more of their territory. But even when military resistance failed, cultural resistance continued. Native American communities developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining their identities under conditions of political and economic domination. They created hidden schools where children could learn traditional languages and customs. They practiced their religions in secret locations, away from European supervision. They maintained traditional economic relationships through underground networks that operated parallel to the official colonial economy. Women played particularly important roles in these cultural resistance movements. In many Native American societies, women were the primary keepers of cultural knowledge, responsible for teaching children languages, stories, and traditions. Even when European authorities tried to force Native American children into European-style schools, mothers often found ways to continue traditional education at home. Indigenous women also played crucial roles in economic resistance. They maintained traditional crafts and trading relationships, even when colonial authorities tried to force Native Americans into European-style economic systems. The beautiful baskets, pottery, and textiles that Native American women continue to produce weren't just art. They were acts of cultural resistance that helped maintain indigenous identities and provided economic independence. Perhaps most importantly, Native American communities never lost their vision of themselves as sovereign peoples with inherent rights to their ancestral territories, even when forced to sign treaties that severely limited their freedom and territory. They generally understood these agreements as temporary accommodations rather than permanent surrenders of their rights. This understanding of sovereignty would become crucial in later legal and political struggles. When the United States was formed and began developing its own policies toward Native Americans, indigenous communities were able to draw on centuries of diplomatic experience and legal precedent to assert their rights as sovereign nations. The complexity of this legal and political resistance is often overlooked in popular accounts of Native American history. European and later American authorities were forced to treat Native American communities as sovereign entities capable of making binding agreements. This created a body of international law that recognized indigenous rights even as colonial and later American policies systematically violated those rights. Native American leaders became skilled diplomats who could navigate multiple legal and political systems simultaneously. They learned European languages and legal concepts while maintaining their own governmental structures and decision-making processes. They played European powers against each other during the colonial period and later used American legal systems to defend their rights. Figures like Tecumseh, who attempted to create a pan-Indian confederacy to resist American expansion, demonstrate the sophisticated political thinking that characterized Native American resistance movements. Tecumseh's vision of uniting all Native American tribes east of the Mississippi River into a single political entity was remarkably prescient. He understood that divided tribes could be conquered individually, but a united indigenous nation might be able to negotiate with the United States as an equal. Although Tecumseh's confederacy ultimately failed, his vision influenced Native American political movements for generations. The idea that indigenous peoples could maintain their sovereignty through unity and political organization became a central theme of Native American resistance that continues to this day. The story of survival and resistance during the colonial period also includes remarkable examples of individual Native Americans who found ways to succeed within European colonial systems while maintaining their indigenous identities. Figures like Pocahontas, who married an English colonist, but continued to serve as a diplomatic liaison between her people and the English, demonstrate the complex navigation required to survive in the colonial world. Samson Occam, a Mohegan man who became a Presbyterian minister and founded several Native American communities in New York, shows how some Native Americans were able to use European institutions to serve indigenous interests. Occam raised money in England to found Dartmouth College, which was originally intended to educate Native American students. These individual success stories are important because they demonstrate that Native American survival wasn't just about maintaining traditional ways of life in isolation from European influence. It was also about finding ways to engage with European colonial systems while maintaining indigenous values and identities. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Native American survival during this period was simply the fact that it happened at all. Given the scale of the demographic catastrophe they faced, the logical outcome should have been complete extinction. The fact that any Native American communities survived with their identities intact is testimony to human resilience that borders on the miraculous. And they didn't just survive. They laid the groundwork for cultural and political revival that would become increasingly important in later centuries. The languages they preserved, the traditions they maintained, the political structures they protected, the legal precedents they established, all of these would become crucial resources for later generations of Native Americans fighting for recognition and rights. The peaceful night in that Native American village that we began with wasn't really the end of Indigenous America. It was the end of one phase of Indigenous history and the beginning of another. What came after was certainly tragic and traumatic, but it was also creative and adaptive and ultimately successful in ways that seemed impossible at the time. The Native American communities that exist today are not remnants or relics of some vanished past. They are the direct descendants of the survivors who found ways to maintain their identities through the worst catastrophe in human history. They carry within them the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of indigenous knowledge, modified and adapted through centuries of creative resistance. Understanding this history of survival and resistance is crucial for understanding contemporary Native American communities and their ongoing struggles for recognition, rights, and resources. It's also crucial for understanding American history more broadly, because the story of America cannot be told honestly without acknowledging the persistence and agency of indigenous peoples throughout the entire historical narrative. The survivors of that peaceful night in 1491 didn't just endure, they prevailed. Their descendants are still here, still fighting, still creating, still maintaining their unique identities while adapting to an ever-changing world. That may be the most remarkable part of this entire story. As we near the end of our journey through this hidden chapter of American history, it's worth asking, what does that peaceful night in 1491 mean for us today? How do the echoes of that last moment of the old world still reverberate through our contemporary lives? The answer might surprise you, because the consequences of that night and everything that followed didn't end with the colonial period. They're still unfolding all around us, shaping everything from the ecological systems we depend on to the political debates we have about justice, sovereignty, and human rights. Let's start with the land itself. The North America you see today, its forests, its grasslands, its wildlife populations, has been fundamentally shaped by the demographic collapse that began in 1492. When Native American populations crashed, their sophisticated environmental management systems collapsed with them. The eastern forests that European colonists encountered weren't natural wilderness. They were the result of thousands of years of indigenous management through controlled burning. When that management stopped, these forests began to change. They became denser, more prone to catastrophic wildfires, and less suitable for many of the species that had adapted to indigenous management. Modern forest management is still dealing with these consequences. Many of the restoration projects happening today are actually attempts to recreate the environmental conditions that existed under indigenous management. Controlled burns, selective clearing, and other techniques are being used to restore forest health, techniques that Native Americans had perfected long before Europeans arrived. The same is true for grassland ecosystems. The Great Plains that seem so iconic and natural to most Americans were actually created and maintained by Native American burning practices working in conjunction with buffalo grazing. When indigenous populations collapsed, these management systems broke down, leading to changes in plant communities that are still visible today. Even our urban environments bear the marks of that peaceful night in 1491. Many of America's major cities are located where they are because Native Americans had already identified those locations as ideal for human settlement. Rivers, harbors, high ground, freshwater sources. Indigenous peoples had already mapped out the best locations for human habitation across the continent. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. All of these cities are built on sites that were chosen first by Native Americans for their strategic and practical advantages. The natural advantages that European colonists thought they were discovering had actually been recognized and utilized by indigenous peoples for centuries or millennia. But the echoes of that night go beyond environmental and geographical legacies. They're also embedded in American law, politics, and culture in ways that most people don't recognize. The U.S. Constitution, for example, was influenced by Native American political systems, particularly the Iroquois Confederacy. The idea of a federal system that balances power between a central government and constituent states was not a European innovation. It was adapted from indigenous models that had been functioning successfully for centuries. The Bill of Rights, with its emphasis on individual freedoms and limitations on government power, also drew on Native American political philosophy. European political thought in the 18th century was still largely based on monarchical models where rights were granted by rulers to subjects. Native American societies, by contrast, generally operated on the assumption that individuals possessed inherent rights that could not be taken away by any government. When European philosophers like John Locke wrote about natural rights and the state of nature, they were often drawing on accounts of Native American societies that emphasized individual freedom and limited government authority. The American Revolution's emphasis on liberty and self-government was inspired partly by European political theory, but that theory was itself influenced by European encounters with indigenous political systems. This influence continues in contemporary American politics, though it's rarely acknowledged. Debates about federalism, states' rights, and the balance between individual liberty and collective responsibility all echo older debates about how to organize human societies that Native Americans had been having for centuries before Europeans arrived. The environmental movement, too, bears the influence of that peaceful night in 1491. The idea that humans should live in harmony with nature rather than trying to dominate it is often presented as a modern insight born from ecological science and environmental activism. But this perspective was actually central to most Native American worldviews long before ecology became a scientific discipline. When contemporary environmentalists talk about sustainability, seven-generation thinking, and the interconnectedness of all living things, they're often unknowingly echoing indigenous wisdom that was developed over thousands of years of careful observation and environmental management. The modern organic farming movement, permaculture, and other alternative agricultural approaches are also rediscovering techniques that Native Americans had perfected long before industrial agriculture. The Three Sisters agriculture that we discussed earlier, corn, beans, and squash grown together, is now recognized as one of the most sustainable and productive farming systems ever developed. But perhaps the most important contemporary echo of that peaceful night lies in the ongoing struggle for indigenous rights and recognition. The Native American communities that exist today are not museum pieces or historical artifacts. They are living, dynamic societies that have maintained their identities through centuries of attempted destruction. Their current struggles for sovereignty, land rights, and cultural preservation are not separate from the story we've been telling. They are the direct continuation of the survival and resistance strategies that began in the aftermath of first contact. When contemporary Native Americans assert their rights to control their own territories, manage their own resources, and govern their own people, they're drawing on legal and political precedents that were established during the colonial period. The treaties that were signed between Native American nations and European colonial powers, and later the United States government, are still legally binding documents. Many of the land rights cases that appear in contemporary courts are based on agreements that were signed centuries ago. The legal concept of tribal sovereignty that forms the basis of modern Native American governance stems directly from the international law that developed during the colonial period. This means that understanding the history of that peaceful night and everything that followed is not just an academic exercise. It's essential for understanding contemporary legal and political issues. When you read about casino gaming rights, water rights disputes, or battles over sacred sites, you're seeing the continuing effects of decisions made in the aftermath of 1492. The demographic legacy of the Great Dying also continues to shape contemporary Native American communities. With a population that was reduced by 90% and then subjected to centuries of additional pressures, Native American communities today face challenges that can't be understood without reference to this historical trauma. High rates of poverty, health problems, and social dysfunction in many Native American communities are not the result of cultural deficiencies or individual failings. They're the direct result of centuries of demographic catastrophe, cultural suppression, and systematic discrimination. Understanding this history is essential for developing effective policies to address contemporary Native American challenges. But it's not just a story of continuing trauma. It's also a story of continuing resilience. Native American communities today are experiencing what many scholars call a cultural renaissance, with growing numbers of young people learning traditional languages, practicing traditional arts and ceremonies, and asserting their indigenous identities. This renaissance is possible because the survival strategies that began in the aftermath of first contact were successful. The languages that were preserved in secret schools, the ceremonies that were practiced in hidden locations, the knowledge that was passed down through oral traditions, all of this cultural wealth is now available to contemporary Native Americans who are working to revitalize their communities. The technological tools of the modern world are actually making this cultural preservation and revitalization easier in some ways. Digital archives can preserve traditional stories and songs. Social media can connect Native Americans across vast distances. Online education can make traditional languages and cultural knowledge available to people who live far from their ancestral territories. In a strange way, the internet is helping to recreate some of the communication networks that existed before 1492, when trade routes and diplomatic relationships connected Native American communities across vast distances. Today, a Lakota teenager in South Dakota can learn traditional beadwork techniques from an Ojibwe artist in Minnesota, or participate in online language classes taught by elders living thousands of miles away. This cultural revival is not just important for Native American communities, it's important for everyone. As our contemporary world faces environmental crises, social inequality, and political polarization, there's growing recognition that indigenous knowledge systems might offer important insights and solutions. The sustainable agricultural techniques developed by Native Americans could help address climate change and food security. Indigenous approaches to conflict resolution and consensus building could inform efforts to heal political divisions. Traditional ecological knowledge could guide ecosystem restoration and species conservation efforts. But accessing this wisdom requires acknowledging the history that we've been exploring, the story of that peaceful night and everything that followed. It requires understanding that Native American communities are not relics of the past, but living repositories of knowledge that has been tested and refined over thousands of years. It also requires confronting some uncomfortable truths about American history and contemporary American society. If Native American populations hadn't been devastated by disease and warfare, if indigenous knowledge systems hadn't been systematically suppressed, if tribal sovereignty hadn't been repeatedly violated, our contemporary world might look very different. We might have more sustainable relationships with our environment. We might have more effective approaches to governance and conflict resolution. We might have a richer understanding of what it means to be human and how to live in community with other people and with the natural world. These are not just abstract historical questions. They're practical issues that affect all of our lives. Climate change, political dysfunction, social inequality, environmental degradation. All of these contemporary challenges might be easier to address if we had access to the full range of human knowledge and experience, including the indigenous wisdom that was nearly lost in the aftermath of 1592. But that wisdom wasn't entirely lost. It survived in the memories and practices of the communities that endured through centuries of catastrophe and oppression. And today, as those communities experience cultural revival and growing political recognition, that knowledge is becoming available again. The question is whether the rest of us are ready to listen and learn. This brings us to one final echo of that peaceful night, the echo that resonates in our contemporary understanding of what America is and what it could become. For most of American history, the dominant narrative has been one of European settlement of an empty wilderness, of civilization triumphing over savagery, of progress marching inevitably westward. But if you understand the true history of that peaceful night in 1491 and everything that followed, this narrative becomes impossible to maintain. America wasn't empty, it was full. European colonization wasn't the triumph of civilization. It was settlement in the aftermath of demographic catastrophe. American progress wasn't inevitable. It was contingent on specific historical circumstances that could have unfolded very differently. This doesn't mean that we should feel guilty about being alive today, or that we should try to recreate the past. History can't be undone, and the world of 1491 is gone forever. But understanding this history can help us make better choices about the future. It can help us recognize that there are many different ways to organize human societies, manage environmental resources, and understand our place in the world. The European way of doing things isn't the only way, and in many cases, it might not even be the best way. It can help us appreciate the remarkable diversity of human cultures and the tragedy that occurs when that diversity is lost. Every language that dies, every traditional practice that's abandoned, every indigenous community that disappears represents a loss of human knowledge and possibility that can never be recovered. It can help us understand that the challenges we face today, environmental crisis, social inequality, political polarization, are not inevitable features of modern life. They're the result of specific choices and historical developments that could have unfolded differently and could still be changed. Most importantly, understanding this history can help us recognize that we're all inheritors of that peaceful night in 1491. The consequences of what happened after, both the tragedies and the triumphs, belong to all of us. The responsibility for addressing those consequences belongs to all of us too. And so we come to the end of our journey through this hidden chapter of American history. We began with a peaceful night in a Native American village in 1491, a night that seemed ordinary to the people living through it, but which we now understand was the last night of the old world. What happened next changed everything. Within a century, entire civilizations had vanished. Millions of people had died. Languages had fallen silent. Knowledge accumulated over thousands of years had been lost forever. The very landscape itself had been transformed as the sophisticated environmental management systems developed by indigenous peoples collapsed along with their populations. But this is not just a story of loss and tragedy. It's also a story of survival, adaptation, and resistance in the face of impossible odds. It's a story of human resilience that borders on the miraculous. It's a story of creativity and innovation and the refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. The Native American communities that exist today are living proof that the human spirit can endure almost anything. They carry within them the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years, modified and adapted through centuries of creative resistance. They are not museum pieces or historical artifacts. They are dynamic, living communities that continue to evolve and grow while maintaining their connection to their ancestral heritage. Their story is also our story, because the consequences of that peaceful night in 1491 shaped the world that all of us inhabit today. The cities we live in, the landscapes we inhabit, the political systems we navigate, the environmental challenges we face, all of these bear the marks of what happened in the aftermath of first contact between the old world and the new. Understanding this history doesn't require us to feel guilty about the past or to try to recreate a world that no longer exists. But it does require us to acknowledge the full complexity of American history and to recognize the ongoing presence and contributions of indigenous peoples. It requires us to understand that there are many different ways to be human, many different ways to organize societies, many different ways to relate to the natural world. The European way of doing things isn't the only way, and in many cases, it might not be the best way. It requires us to appreciate the remarkable diversity of human cultures and to understand what we lose when that diversity disappears. Every indigenous language that falls silent, every traditional practice that's abandoned, every community that loses its connection to its ancestral heritage represents a loss of human knowledge and possibility that affects all of us. Most importantly, understanding this history can help us make better choices about the future. As we face contemporary challenges like climate change, social inequality, and political polarization, we have the opportunity to learn from indigenous knowledge systems that were developed over thousands of years of careful observation and adaptation. We have the opportunity to create more sustainable relationships with our environment, more just and equitable societies, and more effective approaches to governance and conflict resolution. But taking advantage of these opportunities requires acknowledging the history we've explored and recognizing the ongoing contributions of indigenous communities. The peaceful night we began with wasn't really an ending. It was a transition from one phase of human history to another. What came after was certainly tragic in many ways, but it was also creative and adaptive, and ultimately hopeful. The survivors of that night didn't just endure. They found ways to maintain their identities and pass on their wisdom to future generations. Their descendants are still here, still creating, still contributing to the ongoing story of human civilization. Their voices have been marginalized and ignored for too long, but they're becoming harder to ignore as indigenous communities experience cultural revival and growing political recognition. They have important things to teach us about sustainability, community, spirituality, and what it means to live in right relationship with the world around us. The question is whether we're ready to listen and learn. The echoes of that peaceful night in 1491 still reverberate through our world today. In every forest that's managed with controlled burns, in every sustainable farming technique that mimics indigenous practices, in every legal case that asserts tribal sovereignty, in every young person who learns a traditional language or practices a traditional ceremony, the legacy of that night continues. It continues in the ongoing struggles for justice and recognition that define contemporary indigenous movements. It continues in the scientific research that's rediscovering the value of traditional ecological knowledge. It continues in the political movements that are finding new ways to organize human societies based on indigenous principles of consensus and sustainability. But perhaps most importantly, it continues in the simple fact that Native American communities still exist at all. Against all odds, despite centuries of attempted destruction, indigenous peoples have maintained their identities and their connections to their ancestral heritage. They have survived the largest demographic catastrophe in human history and emerged with their cultures not just intact, but growing and evolving. This is one of the most remarkable stories of human resilience in all of history. It deserves to be remembered, honored, and learned from. It deserves to be part of how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. So the next time you walk through a forest, or see a field of corn, or read about debates over environmental policy or political governance, remember that peaceful night in 1491. Remember the world that existed before European contact. A world of millions of people living in thousands of different communities, speaking hundreds of different languages, practicing sophisticated forms of agriculture and environmental management, creating art and music and literature and philosophy that rivaled anything being produced anywhere in the world. Remember what was lost when that world ended, but also remember what survived. Remember the creativity and resilience and determination that enabled indigenous communities to maintain their identities through centuries of catastrophe and oppression. And remember that their story isn't over. The descendants of the people who lived through that peaceful night are still here, still creating, still contributing to the ongoing story of human civilization. They have important things to teach us, if we're willing to listen. Their survival is proof that it's possible to endure almost anything and come out the other side with your identity and your values intact. Their adaptation is proof that it's possible to change and grow while still maintaining connection to your roots. Their resistance is proof that it's possible to fight for what you believe in, even when the odds seem impossible. These are lessons that all of us can learn from, regardless of our backgrounds or circumstances. In a world that often seems chaotic and uncertain, the story of indigenous survival and resilience offers hope and guidance for navigating challenges and maintaining our humanity in the face of adversity. The peaceful night in that Native American village in 1491 was the end of one world, but it was also the beginning of another. What emerged from the catastrophe that followed wasn't just loss and tragedy, but also creativity and adaptation and the stubborn refusal of the human spirit to be defeated. That spirit lives on today in Native American communities that continue to thrive despite everything history has thrown at them. It lives on in the knowledge and wisdom they've preserved and continue to develop. It lives on in their ongoing contributions to art, science, politics, and culture. And it lives on in all of us who are willing to learn from their example and their insights. The story of that peaceful night and everything that followed belongs to all of us. The responsibility for honoring that story and learning from it belongs to all of us too. What will you do with this knowledge? How will you honor the memory of that peaceful night and the remarkable story of survival that followed? How will you contribute to ensuring that Indigenous voices and perspectives are heard and respected in our contemporary world? These are questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. But one thing is certain: the story that began on that peaceful night in 1491 is still being written. And all of us have the opportunity to help determine how it ends. The voices that were nearly silenced forever are speaking again. The knowledge that was almost lost is being recovered. The communities that survived against impossible odds are growing stronger. The night that changed everything is still changing everything. The question is whether we'll have the wisdom to listen to what it has to teach us. If this story has moved you, if it's changed how you think about American history or contemporary indigenous issues, consider exploring more about the Native American communities in your area. Learn about their histories, their contemporary challenges, and their contributions to your local community. Consider supporting indigenous-led organizations working on language revitalization, cultural preservation, environmental protection, and social justice. Consider reading books by Native American authors, viewing art by indigenous artists, and learning about traditional knowledge systems. Most importantly, consider how you can be part of ensuring that the voices that survived centuries of attempted silencing continue to be heard and respected. The peaceful night we explored together may be over, but the story it began continues, and all of us have the opportunity to help write the next chapter.